Henry Rathbone, a man whose name has been lost in the shadows of history, had a fateful tryst with destiny on the fateful night of Abraham Lincoln's assassination. While many know the details of the attack that took the life of the President of the United States, few know about the man who tried in vain to save Lincoln and whose life was irrevocably changed in that moment. On the cold night of April 14, 1865, while the nation was still recovering from the horrors of the Civil War, a shadow of tragedy fell over Washington, D.C. Ford's Theater, a stage of entertainment and escape for many, became the setting for of the darkest events in American history. As the country prepared to celebrate peace and reconciliation, Henry Rathbone, a man whose name would be lost in the shadows of time, was about to have a fateful encounter with destiny. While many know the details of the attack that took the life of the President of the United States, few know about the man who tried in vain to save Lincoln and whose life was irrevocably changed in that moment. Henry Rathbone, a young Union Army officer, was invited to see the play Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater that fateful night. Beside him was his fiancée, Clara Harris, whose fate would tragically intertwine with his that night. As the spectacle unfolded before their eyes, Rathbone and Clara had no idea they were about to witness one of the most impactful events in American history. Actor John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer and ardent supporter of the Southern cause, was plotting an act of violence that would reverberate through the decades. And in that fateful moment, Henry Rathbone's fate was about to be sealed forever. That April evening, Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris, occupied a privileged seat in Ford's Theater, alongside President Abraham Lincoln and his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln. The atmosphere of celebration and expectation was in the air as the play Our American Cousin unfolded on stage. For Rathbone and Clara, this was supposed to be a night of entertainment and fun, a moment of escapism amid the tensions and uncertainties of a war-torn nation. However, fate had other plans. As the actors performed their lines and the audience watched with interest, a dark and determined man crept up to the presidential box. John Wilkes Booth, a talented actor and Confederate fanatic, was about to deliver a fatal blow that would echo through the halls of history. Henry Rathbone, an officer in the Union Army, was about to become an unwitting witness to the tragedy unfolding before his eyes. His heart raced as he realized the imminent threat, but his reaction was too quick, his intervention too late. The sound of a gunshot echoed through the theater, followed by the scream of Mary Todd Lincoln, as Abraham Lincoln fell wounded in his chair. The scene that unfolded at that moment would forever change the course of Henry Rathbone's life. He saw excitement and panic spread throughout the theater as the killer fled into the darkness of the night. Rathbone felt the weight of failure on his shoulders, the pain of helplessness in failing to save the president he had sworn to protect. From that fateful moment, Henry Rathbone became much more than an officer in the Union Army. He became a witness to tragedy, a symbol of the fragility of life and the ephemerality of security. His journey was just beginning, but the shadows of that night would haunt his footsteps forever. Henry Rathbone's heart raced as he realized the imminent threat. His soldier's instincts kicked in, and he threw himself to protect President Lincoln. But fate, ruthless as always, had other plans. As Rathbone lunged to restrain the assassin, John Wilkes Booth fired his revolver, dealing a deadly blow to the nation's leader. The deafening sound of the shot echoed through the theater, piercing Rathbone's ears like a death sentence. He saw Lincoln, the man he had sworn to protect, fall injured in his chair as chaos unfolded around him. The frantic commotion, the screams of horror, and the prevailing confusion made Rathbone feel as if he were trapped in a nightmare from which he could not escape. As Booth escaped into the shadows, leaving behind a trail of chaos and despair, Rathbone found himself plunged into an abyss of anguish and helplessness. He wondered if he could have done more, if his actions could have changed the tragic course of that fateful night. But the unanswered questions only increased his sense of failure and pain. For Rathbone, that moment was more than a failed attempt to save a president. It was a devastating blow to his own sense of duty and honor. He had sworn to protect Lincoln, but was unable to keep his promise when it mattered most. The pain of defeat and the impotence of not being able to save the president would haunt Rathbone for the rest of his days, casting a dark shadow over his already troubled existence. The tragedy of that fateful night was not just a physical wound for Henry Rathbone, it was a wound that would penetrate deep into his mind and soul, leaving invisible scars that would never heal. While the rest of the world tried to move on, Rathbone found himself trapped in a maze of memories and torment, where Lincoln's shadow loomed over him like an unforgiving specter. The struggle to make sense of the terrible loss proved to be an uphill, never-ending battle for Rathbone. Every day was a struggle to keep his sanity intact, while the ghosts of the past haunted him incessantly. The images of that fateful night invaded his mind like a recurring nightmare, dragging him deeper and deeper into an abyss of despair and hopelessness. 18 years have passed since Lincoln's assassination, but to Rathbone, time seemed to stand still on that terrible night. In 1883, the shadows of insanity began to close around him, enveloping him in a downward spiral of madness and despair. His mind, once sharp and focused, began to slowly disintegrate, fragmenting into irreconcilable pieces. The symptoms of Rathbone's mental deterioration were evident to those around him. He became increasingly reclusive and distant, sinking into a world of delusions and hallucinations. His words were incoherent, his thoughts disjointed, as he struggled to distinguish reality from fantasy amid the whirlwind of his own tortured mind. For Rathbone, the weight of guilt and loss was unbearable, a burden he could no longer bear. He found himself trapped in a maze of pain and despair, with no way out in sight. As the world around him continued to spin, he found himself increasingly isolated in his own world of darkness and hopelessness. The tragedy of that night would haunt Rathbone for the rest of his life, slowly consuming him until there was nothing left but the shadows of the man he once was. His mind, once a beacon of rationality and lucidity, was now a dark and claustrophobic prison, where the ghosts of the past haunted him incessantly. And so, Henry Rathbone became yet another silent victim of the terrible tragedy that shook the nation, a soul lost in a sea of madness and despair. Henry Rathbone's mental decline culminated in an act of unspeakable horror that shocked everyone who knew him. Consumed by the insanity that had haunted him since that fateful night at Ford's Theatre, Rathbone found himself plunged into an abyss of despair and hopelessness, where the line between reality and delusion became increasingly blurred. It was in a moment of deep confusion and despair that Rathbone succumbed to the dark impulses that tormented him. He found himself overcome by a torrent of distorted thoughts and disturbing delusions, fueled by the pain and remorse that had consumed him since the Lincoln tragedy. In an act of unfathomable madness, he turned on those he loved most, attempting to take the lives of his own children. The terror unfolded amid chaos and confusion as Clara, his wife, desperately tried to stop him. But her efforts were in vain, and she ended up being fatally injured at the hands of the one she had once sworn to protect. The horror of that scene haunted those who witnessed it, leaving indelible scars on their minds and hearts. Consumed by remorse and despair, Rathbone then tried to take his own life, seeking to escape the abyss of pain and anguish that consumed him. But fate, cruel as always, had other plans. He was prevented from completing his heinous act, and was eventually taken into custody by authorities, where he would await trial for his terrible crimes. The attempted filicide and murder was a shocking and disturbing act that shocked everyone who knew Rathbone. It was a grim reminder of the horrors the human mind can conceive when it is consumed by madness and despair. And for those who witnessed the horror of that fateful night, it was clear that the price of insanity was too high to pay. When the police finally arrived at the crime scene, they were greeted by a scene of indescribable horror. Henry Rathbone was there, but not as the man he once was. His empty eyes reflected the depth of his madness, as he murmured incessantly about hidden figures in the paintings and a plot to poison him. To those who witnessed the scene, it was clear that Rathbone's mind had been consumed by the darkness of insanity. His thoughts were confused and disjointed, his words an incoherent mix of paranoia and delirium. He seemed to be trapped in a world of his own creation, where reality and fantasy merged into a distorted mirage of his own tortured mind. While doctors tried to understand the extent of his madness, Rathbone was taken to an asylum, where he would spend the rest of his days in a state of constant torment. His obsession with security and paranoia only intensified over time as he struggled to find peace in a world that had become an endless nightmare. In the dark halls of the asylum, Rathbone wandered aimlessly, his footsteps echoing like those of a lonely specter seeking redemption. His mind, once sharp and intelligent, was now a dark, claustrophobic prison, where the ghosts of the past haunted him incessantly. He found himself pursued by invisible shadows, always lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. For Rathbone, the asylum became a haven of despair and hopelessness, where the line between reality and fantasy blurred with each passing day. His obsession with security consumed him, turning him into a prisoner of his own tormented mind. And so, he spent the rest of his life, trapped in an endless cycle of madness and torment, where peace and redemption were mere fleeting illusions in a sea of darkness and despair. Henry Rathbone, a name that quietly resonates in the dusty halls of history, was more than just a bystander in the tragedy that unfolded on the fateful night of Abraham Lincoln's assassination. He was a tragic hero whose desperate attempt to save a president ended up sealing his own fate in a downward spiral of madness and despair. However, despite his central role in the tragedy, Rathbone is often overlooked in accounts of Lincoln's assassination. His story is lost between the lines of history, obscured by the shadow of the great man he tried in vain to protect. But his life and his death are a grim reminder of the devastating effects that tragedy can have on the human mind. Rathbone is a silent reminder of the fates that can be sealed in an instant of unexpected horror. His descent into madness is a grim reflection of the indelible traumas left by violence and loss, a painful reminder that even the strongest among us can succumb to the crushing weight of suffering and tragedy. While the world continues to remember Abraham Lincoln as a martyr and a leader, Rathbone remains a forgotten figure, relegated to the anonymity of the dusty pages of history. But his story is a powerful reminder of the price of courage and tragedy, a grim testament to the dangers that lurk in the shadows of the past. Henry Rathbone may have been forgotten by history, but his legacy lives on in every dark shadow and every silent echo of the tragedy that consumed him. He is a silent reminder of the fragility of life and the ephemerality of security, a lonely witness to the horrors that haunt the darkest recesses of the human soul. And while his story remains buried in the forgotten pages of history, his spirit will forever wander in the dark corridors of collective memory, a dark symbol of the mysteries and tragedies that permeate the human experience. I invite you to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our fascinating stories. If you like the content presented, leave a like to help us reach more people. And don't forget to share your thoughts and comments below. Your participation enriches our community and motivates us to continue bringing you quality content. Together we can explore the fascinating world of story and narrative. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.